Imagine a world where war had no rules, where mercy was seen as weakness and cruelty was the currency of power. In the blood-soaked battlefields of ancient history, the horrors of war weren't just side effects, they were carefully crafted strategies. Empires rose not just through diplomacy or conquest, but by making brutality a message, a warning, and a legacy. In this video, we'll uncover 7 of the most shocking and brutal war crimes ever recorded in ancient history. These aren't just stories from dusty scrolls or forgotten ruins. These are real events, where entire cities were wiped off the map, civilians were systematically tortured, and unimaginable cruelty was justified in the name of dominance. From the calculated terror campaigns of the Assyrians to the silent massacre of a forgotten rebellion in Sri Lanka, you'll hear of crimes most history books prefer to whisper, if at all. Stay with us, because some of the darkest truths are the ones rarely told. And by the end of this journey, you'll see how the foundations of many great empires were laid in blood. The Massacre of the Uva-Wellassa Rebellion, Sri Lanka, 1818 CE. In 1818, deep within the jungles and hills of Sri Lanka, a local rebellion sparked against British colonial rule, what would become known as the Uva-Wellassa Rebellion. But what followed wasn't just a military crackdown. It was an act of sheer extermination. The British response was not to defeat the rebels, but to erase them. Entire villages were burned to ash, leaving nothing behind but smoldering ruins and silence. Civilians, men, women, and children, were slaughtered indiscriminately. But the violence didn't stop with bloodshed. The British implemented a scorched earth policy, destroying crops and poisoning water sources, ensuring that even those who escaped the initial massacre would face death through starvation or disease. Livestock were killed, rice fields torched, and entire regions left barren. It was one of the earliest recorded instances of a colonial power using total war tactics not just to conquer, but to punish. The Uva-Wellassa massacre wasn't just a battle lost. It was an entire community wiped from the map, a brutal message from the British Empire to any who dared resist. The Siege of Melos by Athens, 1416 BCE. In 416 BCE, during the height of the Peloponnesian War, the island of Melos stood as an independent neutral entity. While Athens and Sparta clashed in their fight for dominance, Melos chose not to take sides. However, the mighty Athenians could not tolerate such defiance. They demanded Melos's submission, and when the island refused, Athens unleashed one of the most brutal acts of its war campaign. The consequences were horrific. All the adult men of Melos were executed without mercy. The women and children were not spared either, as they were taken as slaves, destined to suffer for the crime of neutrality. The city was leveled and its people decimated. What's chilling is that this was not an act of desperation or survival. It was a deliberate display of power. Under the guise of democracy, Athens justified this ruthless act. It was a reminder to all that resistance, even if peaceful, would not be tolerated. In the end, the Siege of Melos revealed the true face of Athenian imperialism, cruelty masked under the banner of civilization. The Destruction of Thebes by Alexander the Great, 335 BCE. In 335 BCE, after conquering much of the known world, Alexander the Great returned to his homeland, Macedonia. During his absence, Thebes, a prominent Greek city-state, saw an opportunity to revolt against his rule. They believed that the mighty conqueror would not return in time to punish them. However, they were gravely mistaken. In a fit of rage and vengeance, Alexander responded with a brutality that would echo through history. He laid siege to Thebes, and within days, the city was utterly destroyed. The streets, once filled with life, were now blood-soaked. The result was catastrophic. 30,000 citizens of Thebes were either killed or enslaved, their lives snuffed out in a show of terror. For Alexander, this act wasn't just about revenge. It was a clear message to all of Greece. Thebes had dared to resist, and in his eyes, that meant complete annihilation. This brutal act solidified Alexander's legacy, not just as a conqueror, but as a ruler who used fear as a tool to crush any form of defiance. Assyrian Empire, brutality as a terror tactic, 10th to 7th century BCE. The Assyrian Empire, at its peak during the 10th to 7th centuries BCE, was notorious for its use of fear and terror as key strategies in maintaining control. Unlike many empires that relied on diplomacy or military power alone, the Assyrians perfected the art of psychological warfare, wielding brutality as a weapon of mass intimidation. The methods they employed were horrific: flaying, where victims were skinned alive; impalement, where enemies were often left to die in excruciating pain; and public executions, designed to send a clear message to both the conquered and their own people. These acts of cruelty were not hidden in the shadows, but were proudly documented in royal inscriptions, as if to boast of their merciless tactics. Cities that dared to rebel against Assyrian rule were not just defeated, but erased from existence. Entire populations were wiped out, and their lands were left desolate. This reign of terror was not just about subjugation. It was about instilling a fear so deep that resistance seemed unthinkable. Yet this very brutality that secured their dominance also sowed the seeds of their downfall, as over time, the cruelty of the Assyrian Empire sparked widespread rebellion and ultimately led to its collapse. Rome, destruction of Carthage, 146 BCE. The destruction of Carthage in 146 BCE marked the brutal end of the Third Punic War, a conflict that would forever reshape the Mediterranean world. After years of war, the Romans, determined to eliminate their long-standing rival, laid siege to the city of Carthage. The siege lasted for months, but what followed was nothing short of horrific. When the Romans finally breached the walls of Carthage, they unleashed a bloodbath. Entire populations of civilians, men, women, and children, were slaughtered or enslaved. Estimates suggest that over 650,000 people were killed or taken captive in this merciless campaign. The city, once a thriving hub of culture and power, was razed to the ground. Its buildings burned, its structures demolished, and its land salted to prevent anything from growing again. The fall of Carthage wasn't just about winning a war. It was a calculated move by the Romans to send a message to the world. Carthage was wiped off the map entirely, not just as a defeat, but as an example of what would happen to anyone who dared challenge Roman supremacy. The lesson was clear: resist Rome, and you would be erased from history. Vikings, raids on monasteries, 8th to 11th century CE. Between the 8th and 11th centuries, the Vikings became infamous for their brutal raids across Europe, and among their most shocking targets were monasteries, sanctuaries of faith, wealth, and knowledge. These raids weren't just acts of war, they were deliberate assaults on places that symbolized peace and reverence, making the violence even more terrifying. One of the earliest and most notorious of these raids took place in 793 CE at the Lindisfarne Monastery, located on an island off the northeastern coast of England. The Vikings, with their expert seafaring skills, struck without warning, completely overwhelming the defenseless monks who lived there. What followed was a massacre. Monks were slaughtered in cold blood, their sacred lives ending in the most gruesome ways. But the brutality didn't stop there. The Vikings looted the monastery's treasures, including priceless relics, gold, and manuscripts, and set the buildings on fire. The violence of the raid was meant to strike fear into the heart of Christian Europe. This wasn't just a plunder. It was a display of power, a statement that no place, no matter how sacred, was safe from the Vikings' wrath. The destruction of Lindisfarne marked the beginning of a long series of raids on monasteries throughout Europe, signaling the Vikings' ruthless pursuit of dominance through terror. Alexander the Great, Siege of Tyre, 332 BCE. In 332 BCE, during Alexander the Great's relentless campaign to conquer Persia, the city of Tyre stood defiant. Refusing to surrender, the Tyrians believed their fortified island city was invincible, but they severely underestimated Alexander's determination and military genius. To break the siege, Alexander did something few could have imagined. He built a massive land bridge to reach the island. This monumental engineering feat allowed his forces to surround Tyre, cutting off all escape and supplies. The siege lasted for 7 months, and when the city finally fell, the aftermath was nothing short of horrific. Thousands of Tyrians were massacred, their bodies strewn across the blood-soaked streets. But the cruelty didn't end there. Alexander, known for his unyielding resolve, had the survivors, including men, women, and children, subjected to brutal fates. Many were crucified, left to die in agony as a grim reminder of the consequences of defiance. Others were enslaved, sold off as property to serve their conquerors. This ruthless display was not just about military victory. It was a calculated act of dominance. Alexander wanted the world to know that resistance, no matter how fierce, would only lead to annihilation. The fall of Tyre was a grim message: surrender or face total destruction. It was a brutal chapter in Alexander's quest to establish an empire that would be remembered for both its glory and its terrifying cruelty. Conclusion: these war crimes weren't accidents of history. They were deliberate tools of control. Leaders of ancient empires used terror and brutality not just to win battles, but to instill fear, suppress resistance, and establish their dominance across vast territories. These acts were seen as necessary for maintaining power, ruthless but effective in a world where might made right. It's crucial to remember that even the greatest empires, from the Assyrians to the Romans, were built on acts of horrific violence. While their grandeur and achievements are celebrated, the foundation upon which they were built was soaked in blood. The destruction of entire cities, the slaughter of civilians, and the relentless pursuit of power at any cost are dark chapters that we must never forget. Reflecting on these moments of history reminds us of the value of compassion, justice, and peace. As we continue to progress, it's essential that we learn from the past, ensuring that such atrocities are never repeated, and that we work toward a world where humanity's better instincts prevail over cruelty and domination. If this deep dive into history opened your eyes, make sure to like the video, share it with others, and don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from the past.